Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here every week at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can find us online at virginiainstitute.org. And, of course, archives of all of these programs dating back to heaven knows when is at our YouTube channel. Search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. I know the phrase that pays is impeachment, and one would wonder, is anything else going on there? Perhaps the most frightening bit of legislation that's ever come down the pike is back from last year. Nancy Pelosi has resurrected the zombie of HR1 and is trying to get this monstrosity passed again, now with a friendly Senate. And Director of Policy at FreedomWorks, Sarah Anderson, is on with us to kind of break this down. Sarah, how are you doing this morning?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. You know, I mean, you're exactly right. Everyone's brains are on sort of the clickbait issues, which, of course, today and yesterday is impeachment. But you're absolutely right that HR1 is zombie resurrected from last Congress. Nancy Pelosi is looking to push it through, and we're tracking closely what's going on there.
Dana Perino the other day said, Joe Biden is bland with extreme policies, while Donald Trump was extreme with bland policies. I had made the case much less pithily that if you thought 2009 was a lot, stay tuned, just wait and see. And I feel like I was underselling it. This first week of the Biden administration has been eye-popping. I think half of America needs concussion protocols for how fast they've moved things. And you got, where do you want to start with HR1?
Yeah, I mean, that's the eternal question with this bill. Like you said, it's called the quote-unquote For the People Act, which I think is terrifying. You know, it reminds me of, Ronald Reagan's quote, the most terrifying words are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Yeah. Of course, for the people means also by the people. And this bill is certainly not by the people. It is written by the politicians in Washington, D.C. And like you said, it's called HR1, which means that it's one of the first couple of bills that are actually reserved for the Speaker of the House to choose which bills she wants to be those kind of big-ticket items. Mm-hmm. And so that should concern you right out the gate that this is the one that Nancy Pelosi chose to be HR1. Again, we've called it the For the Politicians Act, or the Incumbency Protection Act, or whatever you might want to call it. Really, like you said, there's so many different parts of this bill. There's 10 different titles of it. It's incredibly long. But mostly what it does is it federalizes elections, which is very, very problematic because, of course, our country is built upon being the United States of America, right? The Constitution tells us that states run their elections for Congress, and states are able to dictate and decide how their elections should be run. This bill would upend all of that, while at the same time having a pretty chilling effect on First Amendment freedom of speech by requiring the disclosure of different political causes that individuals donate to, which I think over the past couple of years we've seen how dangerous that can be as people dox their neighbors, their friends, their coworkers for donating to political causes they disagree with. And that's just when they can find it out privately. Of course, making this type of information public exposes so many people to potential threats of violence, and threats via social media saying, oh, this person donated to that cause, go out and get them. And of course, we oppose everything to do with that. And it's just, a leftist agenda item to try to stifle people from supporting causes that they believe in. Well,
and look at what the Senate proposed in the impeachment trial. They said, hey, maybe we should take our impeachment vote in secret. What? Now, first off, I mean, that's a whole other can of fish. But if they're afraid to let their feelings be known publicly, what are they trying to do to try to stifle Americans' own opinion? The orthodoxy, you're talking about the whole, not just voting, but this whole ethics division of HR1 really is chilling. I'm not surprised it's not the number one thing, but I guess she wanted people to get lost in all the nuance and the page. I mean, just the summary of it is about 25 pages long, isn't it, Sarah?
Right. Yeah, it is. And if you open up the bill, it'll say every bill has kind of the purpose outlined at the start of it. And Democrats say this bill, the purpose of it is to expand Americans' access to the ballot box, reduce the influence of big money in politics, strengthens ethics rules for public servants, implement other anti-corruption members, and for the purpose of fortifying our democracy. So, again, like you said, it's all these kind of feel-good words that really what they mean, though, by this is unconstitutionally nationalizing elections, stifling free speech, imposing big government questionable mandates, and undermining the Constitution. So really, if I could rewrite that purpose title, that's what I would make this bill be. But like you said, now we have a Senate that is controlled by Democrats. They are going to try to push this bill through the House sometime likely later this month or next month. But kind of the scariest part that we're concerned about is the potential for something like this to be shoved through the Senate if the Democrats decide to either get rid of the legislative filibuster, or even more recently, they've been talking about just ignoring a lot of the rules that would require 60 votes to get bills through under a process called reconciliation. Yeah. And if they do that, they can include pretty much anything they want in that type of bill. So Democrats ignore the norms time and time again. Certainly this bill is no exception, and we're pretty worried about, any member who's going to get caught into, trapped into supporting this bill effectively, because, how can you vote against something that's for the people? Right. And that's what we're in the business of pushing back against.
Well, and of course, Sarah Anderson is policy director at FreedomWorks, freedomworks.org, and one of the great still standing standard bearers, even as some of your founders have been cowed into complicity. I was reading, now I'm trying to remember which one of the Koch brothers, I think it was Charlie, was in Esquire magazine apologizing for all his political efforts and saying if he had it all to do over again, including founding things like FreedomWorks, he wouldn't do it. This is what we've done. Could you imagine for a second a world where George Soros went into Esquire magazine and said, boy, I'm really sorry for all the political activity I was involved in?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly wouldn't, and we've seen that with his funding of these DA campaigns across the country has been really interesting to watch. But yeah, it's important that you bring up George Soros, because from a bill like this, you would think that all the dark money is on the right. I guess a well-kept secret is that all the dark money is not on the right. It is certainly on the left. The dark money in Washington is not funneling through groups like FreedomWorks for sure. We are a limited government grassroots organization, and, primarily our focus on delivering to our activists across the country just principles of freedom. This kind of idea that right-leaning groups are bankrolled by some type of dark money. Sheldon Whitehouse will talk about it time and time again on the Senate floor. And I think it's pretty funny. Our grassroots director posted a photo on Facebook, I guess a couple months ago, of me and him sitting in these cardboard boxes that we were packing of, kind of just some swag supplies of FreedomWorks things to send out to some of our top activists. And he captioned it, this is the dark money that the Washington Post warns you about. It's just comical when you see the amounts of money that funnel through the left versus what the left will try to tell you funnels through the right. Which just exactly feeds the narrative that they're trying to stop the right at all costs, and they're trying to use the government to do it, which is unfortunately par for the course.
Well, and that's a big portion of the For the People Act, which is campaign finance reform, which is really, it looks like a laundry list of all the things they've tried to do, all just piled onto one bill and saying, all right, well, we couldn't do this one at a time. Maybe we can do it all at a time, including, for the most part, the federal government deciding who can and can't run for a position in the federal government, which is insane.
Yeah, they're also, like I mentioned, requiring any organizations, quote, involved in political activity to reveal their donors publicly, which is terrifying when you think that, pretty much you post a photo of your dog on Facebook and somebody has a political comment about that. Everything's political these days. They redefine what's political coordination, which effectively bans nonprofit grassroots groups like FreedomWorks from contacting elected officials and saying, hey, we represent this number of Americans in the country and this is what they believe. It effectively criminalizes that, which is pretty much an assault on the ability of Americans to petition their government effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And then one provision of HR1 that I find just absolutely mind-boggling is a taxpayer-funded subsidy for small dollar campaign contributions. It's a 6-to-1 match, meaning that if you donate small dollar to a campaign, they will match that donation to a political campaign with taxpayer dollars. So think about what that means is that your tax dollars would go toward funding a political campaign that you disagree with. What a gross misuse of taxpayer dollars. Think Democrats funding pro-Second Amendment campaign ads, Republicans paying taxpayer dollars toward a pro-abortion candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Like, all of this
Mm-hmm.
is just absolutely mind-boggling, and it's all for the end of advancing the leftist agenda.
Well, and that's sort of a core of everything that Nancy Pelosi has stood for, as far as I can tell, in her both of her terms as Speaker of the House, is using your money to pay for things that you wouldn't pay for otherwise, whether it be under the direct premise of you're a greedy SOB and there are poor people, don't you understand, or these are just things that we've implied are rights and we have to make sure they're there because we say so, and that's the kind of stuff that is. Do you think this would apply to the Center for Technology and Civic Life? That's the group that Mark Zuckerberg purchased for $350 billion and then, quote, helped Atlanta, Detroit, who was it? Atlanta, Philadelphia, and there was one other city that they, quote, and Milwaukee, helped them with their voting machines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that you bring up that type of sort of massive organization, because that's what these laws really are intended to do at the end of the day is, these massive corporations, industries, et cetera, that people seem very upset at a number of the time, they get carve-outs in legislation like this. Mm-hmm. And that's what has allowed them to grow so big. If people are concerned about the growth of big tech companies or groups like Amazon, Walmart, et cetera, these massive corporations, they get to grow that big. Of course, they're effective organizations, but they also lobby for what we like to call regulatory capture, which is special carve-outs and loopholes in federal law that allow them to grow bigger and bigger and bigger at the expense of these smaller businesses and companies and individuals who are trying to make their way and be a real competitive source to these large groups. So, to your point, I mean, I think it speaks exactly to the problem with bills like HR1 creating more and more corruption by the carve-outs that they have in there than it does to combat corruption in any actual way.
Sarah Anderson is on with us. She's Director of Policy at FreedomWorks, freedomworks.org, on this week's Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Sarah, I think it's important to remind people, and I probably should have done it earlier because the keyboard warriors are out there saying you and I hate, small ethnic children and
right.
eat small puppies on the side of the road. We're not saying this because we hate people. We're saying this because these kind of policies, this kind of governing has never worked in the history of mankind. This is why there are no great world-class Soviet-era automobiles. There are no great, and of course we all point to Venezuela. It was mandatory wage increases, then it was mandatory price controls, and then it was food riots. And that was years after nationalizing some of the biggest industries, the most natural resource wealthy country in the new world, as it were, except for the United States, and it's bankrupt. So that's just a modern example. You've got examples all the way through society of collapsed economies based on these kind of dictates. Why do we think we can do it better this time? Because it's going to create a horrible outcome for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why we're so concerned about HR1. And we know last Congress, what they attempted to do after they passed it through the House was break this bill down into a bunch of smaller little bills and push them through the House and attempt to get the Senate to take them up with the purpose of trying to peel Republican members off to vote for bits and pieces of this bill. And that's where it can get really dangerous, because then they can say, oh, hey, look, this bill actually has bipartisan support because, 4 Republicans support this aspect of it and 6 Republicans support that aspect of it. So it's really important that, the grassroots communities out there not only call their member of Congress and tell them to oppose HR1 in its entirety, but also in its individual pieces, because, while it might sound good as a one-off, of course, at the end of the day, their goal is to get this whole thing through. And it's all a political play to make that happen and to move us kind of further toward these centrally planned systems that, like you say, have failed time and time and time again.
And because they learn, they're intelligent creatures, these leftists, they've now included provisos, and this is one of my favorite ones, severability. So they've actually written into the law, if any part of this law is found to be unconstitutional, it won't affect any other part.
Yeah.
Which is what they learned from Obamacare. But now it's amazing how they can write these things, and it would be like saying, well, if that Jim Crow law is found to be unconstitutional, it doesn't affect all the other Jim Crow laws. So too bad on you. If something's unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional as far as I'm understanding it. But do you hold out any hope that whether it's part by part or all en masse, any justice would ever, feel the urge to stand out against something like this and rule? We just watched the Fourth Circuit being asked about some of this, and they were teetering. I think it was on the domestic terrorist list, and they said, well, the inconvenience the people on the list are going to face is insignificant compared to, and I'm reading this from judges on the Fourth Circuit, and I'm thinking, oh my God, it's obvious. I don't want to be hair on fire, but I don't know if we can count on their courts anymore to be impartial.
Yeah, that's why I think it's so important that we had President Trump for these past 4 years nominating people to these courts who believe in an originalist interpretation of the Constitution, right? Reshaping the federal judiciary is one of the kind of under-noticed legacies of the Trump administration that, hopefully going forward, we have a pretty solid slate of judges on these courts who understand the way the Constitution actually works, and that it's not just a malleable document that can mean whatever you want it to mean at any given moment. So a little bit of hope held out there for some of the federal courts that have been reshaped by the Trump administration nominees and what the Senate was able to get confirmed. But certainly a concern the left takes to the courts oftentimes to try to push their policy priorities. Of course, it's largely due to the failures of Congress to actually pass constitutional laws and put in place bills that are less ambiguous than they are more ambiguous. But it is absolutely critical that we have those judges on those courts to look at stuff exactly like HR1 and say, actually, this bill is riddled with, things that are blatantly in violation of the Constitution, and it can't stand.
Sarah, at the end of the day, we saw, I think it was Rand Paul proposed a vote on whether or not it was even constitutional to impeach a private citizen, and what are you impeaching him from? And I think there are subtexts that we could spend hours talking about. But he called the vote, and 5 Republicans voted along with all the Democrats that, sure, if we say it's constitutional, it must be constitutional. Does that give you fear that maybe even those 5 or other 5s, or there are other Republicans that would go along with a bill like HR1?
Yeah, there's, of course, always a concern for that, and that's why we're always thankful for people like Rand Paul who are willing to stand up and say, hey, I'm just going to ask a basic question. Do we think this is constitutional or not? And I think the more we ask those types of questions, at least it gets people thinking about it. I think you saw yesterday, the 5 GOP senators who voted against, Rand Paul on that position largely are posturing for political purposes, which is, again, the problem. But I think the more that members are asked and made to go on the record about questions of constitutionality, the less they can, at the end of the day, inject politics into it. So, the more questions like that are asked, I think the better. And hopefully over time we'll see members voting more often. The Senate doesn't like to vote on things. It's not supposed to be easy to be a member of Congress. It's supposed to be difficult, but they like to make it as easy as they can. They like to avoid hard votes. And so we're always trying to get members on the record, and certainly thankful to Rand Paul for, standing up and consistently being someone to get senators to say, hey, which side do you come down on this type of thing?
Listen, Sarah, I don't know about your world, but those 3-day work weeks can really grind on somebody after a while.
Yeah, no kidding. They come in, late on Tuesday, leave early on Thursday, and it's a good life, I guess.
Sarah, last one. You mentioned reconciliation. If I understand, that's budget finagling. So how would this? I guess because it's got money for campaign finance and funding for voting and basically buying out state elections boards. Do you believe that this is something they could find some way to just weave into a budget bill and then do a reconciliation on it?
Hopefully not. But again, it would involve kind of blowing up what has been the norm for budget reconciliation process, meaning that bills that go through reconciliation can only impact revenues and outlays, spending in versus spending out. And if they can find it's policy neutral, just affecting the budget outlays. But that's dictated by what's known as the Byrd Rule, which is named after Senator Robert Byrd, a former senator from West Virginia. And it's actually statute, but it's really only governed by the recommendations of the Senate parliamentarian, who at the end of the day, if the presiding officer of the Senate in the chair chooses to overrule what the parliamentarian recommends, the Byrd Rule effectively doesn't matter. So actually, our Vice President of Legislative Affairs wrote a pretty good blog post on this on our website just yesterday at FreedomWorks.org, talking about the potential for a minimum wage increase to be included in a budget reconciliation bill. But that's really just only one option that they could potentially throw in there if they decide to just completely ignore the rules of the process. So hopefully something like HR1 could never get passed through budget reconciliation because clearly it is not a budgetary issue. But, Democrats don't seem to care about long-standing tradition or norms of the Senate, let alone the country itself. So we'll be tracking that closely, but definitely check out that blog post for kind of some more information on how they might ignore the Byrd Rule and what that might mean.
FreedomWorks.org is where you find them. Sarah Anderson, thank you so much for joining us this week. She's the Director of Policy there, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. You too.
And thank you for tuning in. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.